I'd like to welcome Peter Felton, one of the authors of Relationship Rich Education. Leo Lambert had hoped to be here, but he had a medical procedure that was rescheduled for a second time, and he's not able to make it, and he apologizes. He does say he's extremely grateful for the education he received at SUNY Geneseo. He was a first-generation member of person in his family to attend college, and he really wishes he could be here with everyone today. So
sorry to jump in, John. Do you want to enable the transcript?
Oh, yes.
Captions. Thanks.
That usually is open. Okay, it is enabled. Thank you. And Peter is the executive director of the Center for Engaged Learning, the assistant provost and professor of history at Elon University. Welcome.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me with you remotely. This is going to be sort of conversational. I have some things to share, but when John and Jessamine and I were trading, and Leo were trading emails about this, we thought this more like a taster for the book than the whole meal, because there's going to be reading groups. And so you can enjoy the whole meal, but maybe give you a flavor of what's there. I'm planning to use breakout rooms at one point, so you'll have some time to talk with your peers. And honestly, the whole time, if you want to use chat, if you want to raise your hand, if you want to just jump in, we can have conversation as we go. I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides just to, again, to sort of offer the frame for things. But this is not meant to be a talk, right? So here we go. Again, thanks for having me. What I'm doing, or what we're doing today, is sort of teasing this book, Relationship Rich Education, which Leo and I wrote. It came out on Election Day 2020, so which was a momentous day. And it was sort of strange as a writing process, because we did all the research for this book in 2018, 2019. And we sent it to our publisher, Johns Hopkins, and then a pandemic hit. And we thought, oh no, like everything is changing in higher education. And, we wrote a book based on the past, but it turns out one of the one of the unexpected outcomes of the pandemic, I think, is many of us came to realize how important human interactions are in what we do in education and in our lives, right? So although our research doesn't draw on any pandemic-informed interviews, it might be resonant. And Leo and I, along with two colleagues, Isi Sartze Vega and Oscar Moreno, are writing a new book based on this that's for first-year students. And we interviewed a whole pile of students last summer. So I could talk some about those interviews, if you'd like, to get a sense of how students understood their their time in college during the pandemic. But so this book, which is what the teaser is for, is really based on two things. The first thing it's based on is almost 400 interviews that Leo and I did at a little more than 24 colleges and universities around the US, everywhere from LaGuardia Community College in Queens, down to Florida International in Miami, over to Cal State Dominguez Hills in LA, and up to the University of Washington in Seattle. So all different kinds of institutions, all different kinds of students. And what we wanted to do is get an understanding of how students, how faculty, how staff at diverse institutions talked about the way human interactions and human connections related to their success, their work in higher education. So that's the core part of the book. And I'm going to share 4 quotes from those interviews as we go. And Liz, Scott, Jessamine, and Ramin are going to be the voices of those quotes. So, and we'll do that before we get to the breakout rooms. The other foundation for this book is decades and decades and decades of research by wiser and more experienced scholars than me looking at how undergraduate education works in the United States. And there's a book some of you may know called How College Affects Students. This is from the 3rd edition of How College Affects Students, which is a synthesis of the research on undergraduate education. And what these decades of research show, like it says, is that student faculty, student staff, and student-student interactions are sort of it. If you're looking at what is really, really significant in any kind of student outcomes, any kind of positive student outcomes you want to look at, you really should look at the quality of interactions, the quality of relationships students form with their peers, most importantly, but with faculty and staff also. Two broad things to supplement this that I want to make sure are really clear as you think about this research. And again, it's not just learning, it's well-being. There's actually strange research, strange to me, I'm a historian, so I think a lot of this is strange, that students who have strong relationships with faculty in college are more likely to vote as alumni. What's that about, right? But that seems like a positive outcome. Okay, two things to know about this broad research. One is it's about quality more than quantity. So this is not some sort of social media thing where if you can report that you have 1,000 relationships in college, you have orders of magnitude better college experience than someone who reports 2. What you need is meaningful, high quality interactions, right? So it's quality more than quantity. The other thing, this probably won't surprise you, is that the stakes of these interactions are higher for first-gen students and students of color. In other words, the positive effects of positive interactions with peers, with faculty, with staff are stronger for first-gen students and students of color than they are for majority students. And the negative outcomes of a lack of interactions or negative interactions, the negative interactions are worse, right, for first-gen students or students of color. Things are higher stakes for them, right? So this matters a lot. It matters in particularly for new majority students, and it's quality over quantity, right? So that's what the research very generally says that was done by other people. Let me just give you well, when I was in graduate school, my first year, I had a course with Dr. Forgy. And what he used to say to me, I was in history, is he would say, Mr. Felton, history is not a mystery. Don't wait till the end to tell them what's important. So here we go. In the book, Leo and I synthesize all that research, synthesize our almost 400 interviews, and get to these 4 points, these sort of 4 principles about what do relationships do? What do human connections do that matter for undergraduates, and particularly for new majority undergraduates? And you can see these, but let me just unpack them really quickly. One, and the first one, is that these kinds of interactions, these kinds of relationships are really foundational in getting a student a sense that they're welcome, they're cared for, they matter, they belong in higher education. And one of my favorite phrases from our interviews, you'll see in the book, is a comment we heard from a community college president who said, what students need is not just to be welcomed on the first day of class, first time they're on campus, in an orientation. They need relentless welcome. They need to feel like in every interaction, in every class meeting, and every time they're talking to someone from the college, that person cares about their success, wants them to be there. Right. And this is really foundational. Without this sense of welcome and care, almost nothing else is possible. Okay. Secondly, what relationships really do is they inspire students to learn. So sometimes we talk to faculty in particular who have this sense like this is soft, right? This is like kindergarten. Every student comes in and you give them a hug and everything is okay. And the exact opposite is what we heard from students over and over, and what actually the research says. What students told us at all sorts of different institutions, all sorts of different backgrounds, all sorts of different demographics of students said, if a professor knows who I am and cares about me, I'm going to work harder for them because I don't want to disappoint them, right? If I'm just anonymous, it's just on me. Right. So we saw over and over students talking about how peer relationships would inspire them. They might say, no one in my family, no one who looks like me do I know who is a college graduate. And then I was in this class and there was this person. And it's like, that's me in 2 years, right? I can do this, right? So peers can really inspire. One of my favorite quotes that I'm not using in this talk is from a student named Jose Robles, who was a nursing student at Nevada State College outside Las Vegas when we interviewed him. He had to take a gen ed science course that he was really cranky about because he didn't want to take gen ed science. He was taking a ton of sciences pre-nursing. So he took this geology course, and he said the professor was amazing. She made something as boring as rocks interesting. Right. And what she said is she shared her passion for rocks, and she got him excited about rocks. And then she had students working together to figure stuff out about rocks. That inspired him to really care about rocks. Right. So relationships can really have this motivational quality. A third thing we saw, and this draws heavily not just on our own interviews, but on work by Brad Johnson, who's a scholar of mentoring at the Naval Academy. And he studies mentoring in higher ed, he studies mentoring in the military, he studies mentoring in professional settings. And what Brad's work shows, and our interview showed, is that what many of us experienced in graduate school of having like one supervisor who sort of ruled them all is actually not healthy or what students need. What students need, to use Brad Johnson's phrase, is a constellation of mentors. They need a network. They need a set of people who can do different things for them. So as a history professor, I can help my students learn to think critically about the past, to read critically, to write well, and all these sorts of things. But I might not be the right person to help them get a job in certain areas, or to help them think about who they are. As a Black woman in American society right now, there's a number of things I can do. There's a number of things I can't do, right? And what we find really helpful about this concept of webs of relationships or constellations is, first, our job is to help students make those connections. So how can our courses, how can our work be a space where they're making lots of connections? It's not just about us. And secondly, it doesn't have to be about me. Right? I don't have to develop a strong relationship with every student for my course or my work to be powerful. What I need to do is enable my students to develop meaningful relationships. Because we already are too busy. We already have too many obligations. So if it's all one-on-one through me, it's never going to work. Fortunately, it's not. The last of our principles is, you can see that students often approach higher education, because we often talk about higher education as a very transactional thing. As one student said to us, my goal was to get in, to get through, and get out. Right. And it's important they get in, and it's important that they get through, and it's important they get out, right? But that's not the point of higher education. The point isn't just credentialing. The point is really to help the students, consider, who am I? Who am I becoming? What can I contribute for my family, to the world? How can I make my community a better place? How can I be successful, whatever that means to me? And the research shows, our interviews reinforce this, that students can do that kind of introspection, that kind of reflection on their own, and some of them do. But for many of them, what's most powerful is doing it with others, especially with respected and trusted others. And Sandra, I think it is, put something in the chat. I can do this. It's my favorite student sentence. I love that too. But you know what we heard even more from students when we interviewed them is when someone they trusted and respected said, you can do this. That was more powerful than I can do this. Because really, the biggest message I took from all these interviews is students need us to affirm their capacity to succeed. Right? That doesn't mean it's not like self-esteem, everybody's good. It's Peter, you're capable of doing really good work. This work might not be really good work, but I know you're capable of it. I've seen it. I know you have it in you. And that kind of support, affirmation, challenge is so powerful. A story that shows up just in passing in the book, but it's the most important educational story almost in my education, is a first-year student. We talked briefly about Leo's experience at SUNY Geneseo. I went to Marquette University and I took a philosophy course my first semester. And the professor emailed me the paper at the end of the semester, or mailed me, this is way before normal humans did email, mailed me the paper, and she gave me an A, and she wrote on it, Peter, this was the best paper in the class, but you could have written a better paper. come see me in the spring. I want to talk about this. And it totally changed my educational experience, because it really made me think about, so what's the purpose here? What am I trying to do? Not just get an A, right? That kind of thing can be really transformational. It was for me, it can be for your students. Okay, so that's sort of big picture, big ideas in the book. I told you taster, that this is a taster in the book. And I don't really think you get a good sense of the book if you don't get a sense of some of the people we interviewed. So I'm going to share 4 quotes that
Sure.
illustrate some of the things that come up in the book. And the first one, which is pretty short, so Liz is lucky, is from Matt Smith at Cal State Dominguez Hills. If you don't know, Cal State Dominguez Hills, it's got about 22,000 students, mostly students of color, many immigrant students in South Central LA. And this is what Matt told us when we said, tell us about teaching and working with students at Dominguez Hills. Go ahead, Liz.
Once your students recognize that you care about them and about where they come from and about their goals and what they're trying to accomplish, then you have a strong foundation for teaching and learning.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, there's a scholar, Laura Rendon, who has a theory that informed a lot of our work, a theory called validation theory that looks at exactly what Matt is describing. That what students really need is this sense, not just that you care that they're successful in the course, right? But that they as a whole person matter in college. And if they have that sense, Rendon's work shows they're much more likely to ask for help. They're much more likely to work harder. They're much more likely to be successful, right? So this is really powerful. One of the themes you'll see running through the book is how do we help our students see that asking for help, using academic resources and social resources and other resources that our institutions offer is really a sign that they're a successful student and not a bad student, right? And so this sense that students can have that you care about them, where they come from, what their goals are, that's sort of the whole package. And one reason why it's so important, and Scott gets the shortest quote of these, and because I want to have a lot of time for us to talk, there's lots of other quotes I could share, but this is really short. But this is something we heard at almost every institution we went to, 28 institutions. This is a student at the University of Michigan. In the book, we name everybody. We actually asked permission to use a particular quote and name, and this student didn't want their name associated with this quote, but so we don't name them. But this is what this student said at Michigan, but it was true at so many institutions.
This is not the place, or not the kind of place where you can ask for help.
Right. Well, wait, this is not the kind of place where you ask for help. Students know there are resources available. Students actually generally think faculty would help them. They just think, in general, especially first generation students, think that only weak students need to ask for help. Only failing students need to ask for help. Only struggling students need to ask for help. And so what they think is that's a sign of weakness, so they don't want to do it, right? They think I'm a good student if I can do this on my own. Claude Steele, a psychologist, uses a phrase that I think is really helpful. He talks about over-efforting, that many students, especially first-gen students, their solution to every problem is to work even harder on their own, right? That's how they've been successful. And and for many of our first-gen students, they've been amazingly successful against the odds, right? And what has allowed them to do that? They didn't have this big network of support necessarily that walked them through everything. They just worked and worked and worked and worked. And when they struggle, they just keep working, right? Even harder. And that can be helpful, but there's a limiting factor on this. Eventually, you do need advice. You do need help, right? And so how do we help students understand that seeking help, asking questions, using the counseling center, the tutoring center, the writing lab, or going to office hours, that's a sign that they're a successful student, not that they're a flawed student, as Michelle says. Faculty often feel that way, right? I agree completely. I think it's chronic for faculty. And, and unfortunately, the academy rewards that too. So working really hard on your own is often the path to be successful in higher ed, even if it's not a healthy path or a successful path. Yeah. Okay, so this is a really serious challenge. I want to give you an example of what a faculty member can do. And this is a quote Jessamyn's going to read. It's actually on 2 slides, but I want to tell you a tiny bit about Joshua. Jessamyn gets a prize because she's reading like 8 times as much as Scott. But let me tell you a tiny bit about Joshua Rodriguez, the person who we interviewed, who this quote is from. Joshua, when I interviewed him, was a student at Oakton Community College. He is first in his family to go to college, born and raised in Chicago. He did well in high school, wanted to be a nuclear engineer, got a scholarship to the University of Illinois, went down to Champaign-Urbana, did well his first semester in classes, but didn't feel like he fit in at the University of Illinois. And he said in the interview, fortunately, my girlfriend got pregnant and he dropped out of school, moved back home to Chicago. They got married. He worked. They started raising a family. And as Joshua's kids got into school themselves, he said he started thinking, well, I want to show them that we're the kind of family that, follows our educational goals. And he also really wants to be a nuclear engineer. So he decided to go to Oakton Community College, the local community college, to start again. And he said the first day of class when he went back to college, the second time was his 30th birthday. And the first class he took was Calculus 2, which seems crazy to me as a historian, but he had done well in Calculus 2 at the University of Illinois. He knew he needed this to be a nuclear engineer. So this was foundation, right? So this is what he told us then. Here we go, Jessamyn.
Early in Calculus 2, we started getting into really difficult things, and I suddenly began having these feelings like I didn't belong in this class, that my education, what I was trying to achieve, wasn't possible, and my goals were just obscenely farther away than I thought they were.
Okay, pause for a second. We're going to hear more from Joshua and Jessamyn in a minute, but I just want everyone to notice this. He doesn't say early in Calculus 2, we started getting into hard things and I thought, wow, math is hard. He says something else. My education, when I'm trying to achieve my dreams, are obscenely further away than they thought they were, right? That's very different than math is hard. This is what happened.
I went to Professor Arco to say that I might drop out. He told me, Joshua, I don't want you to do the homework tonight. I want you to look up imposter syndrome and read about it. Then come and talk to me. I did that, and I learned that it is extraordinarily common among students. That interaction bolstered my confidence to realize that I'm not alone in this, that everyone has these feelings. I went from contemplating dropping out to getting tutoring help and then getting an A in the course.
Thanks, Jessamyn. To close Joshua's story a little bit, he got his degree from Oakton. He will graduate this spring from Purdue on scholarship in nuclear engineering. And if he were here, I talked to him actually a couple months ago, he would say Professor Arco is the reason why he's able to do this. Professor Arco was an adjunct who Joshua had no relationship at all except in this one course. This isn't some lifelong mentor. It's what Brad Johnson, the person I mentioned before, calls a mentor of the moment, right? This is someone who crossed paths with Joshua, saw what was really going on for him, and gave him just the right advice, just the right challenge at just the right moment, right? So this is another example of, to be able to have a strong influence on our students' education, we don't have to, become this sort of uber mentor in all ways in their life. Small interactions can mean a lot. Leah Lambert, my co-author, says the biggest lesson he took from the interviews we did all around the country with students was that there are so many students who are one conversation away from dropping out of college. And they don't need someone to fix all their problems. What they need is someone to really listen to them, someone to really as Matt Smith said earlier, sort of validate that they matter as a person. So the last quote, Ramin is going to read this. It's from Samantha Paskvan at the University of Washington. Let me tell you a tiny bit about Samantha before we get the quote. Samantha is from Alaska, of all places, went to the University of Washington, really wants to be a doctor, but she'd always been very serious about dance. So she double majored in dance and chemistry at the University of Washington. And she was really struggling in chemistry because she knew to be a doctor, she should do undergraduate research, and she wasn't finding it in chemistry. She just wasn't connecting with faculty. She wasn't connecting with the material. She eventually had a genetics course and loved the course so much. She said the professor used active learning a lot. She really got to know a lot of her peers. It was a really powerful course. After the course ended, she went up to the professor and asked if she could join their research lab. And they said, no, but maybe one of my colleagues. And so introduced Samantha to a couple of colleagues. She ended up doing undergraduate research for 2 years at University of Washington. And Ramin will read how she described what happened in the lab.
Beyond the serious science we're doing, there is a whole other aspect of caring about each other's lives. The faculty will make the time to ask, how are your classes going? What are you thinking about for next year? What are you getting involved in outside of the lab? Who do you want to be after you graduate? And then they would really listen and encourage me, even when I wasn't sure if I knew what I was doing or where I was going.
Thanks, Ramin. And just want you to really hear Samantha's words. She isn't saying what faculty or staff did is give her all the answers, right? What she most appreciated was good questions and then someone really listening and encouraging. And I would say, based on the research, also sort of offering resources or supports. That's what students need. That's what students really want. And that's what relationships can do, is give students the space to ask these kinds of questions or to think about these things like, who do I want to be after you graduate? That's a hard, scary question. Students might have a quick answer that's probably not a real answer. So having someone just listen to them can be very, very powerful. Okay, so thanks, Ramin, Jessamine, Scott, Liz, for reading those quotes. What I'm going to encourage you to do now is actually go into breakout rooms, and I'll give you some questions and have 10 or 12 minutes of conversation about this. One of the points I want to emphasize here, and we try to emphasize in the book, is that the answers to how to do this work, relationship-rich work with our students really well, aren't in the book. You actually know how to do this. You're probably doing this already with some of your students, or some things work. You have a colleague who's really good at this, right? And so the first thing I want you to think about in the small groups after you meet everybody and introduce yourself is to talk about, what do you do already that works? And works can be, what do I do already that helps my students build strong peer relationships in class to learn things? Or it can be, what do I do already that helps me connect with students in ways that are meaningful? Or how do I help students connect with other people in ways that are meaningful, right? So a bunch of talk about that, because I'm really convinced the path forward again is through doing even more of what we do that works already, not necessarily adopting all new everything. And then if you have time, the second question is, okay, so this sounds great, this makes me feel good, but it's hard. So can we talk about some of the reasons why this is hard to do? Okay, so maybe 12 minutes in breakouts, introduce yourself, talk about what you do already that works, barriers, and then we'll use the rest of the time, so we'll have almost 20 minutes for just open discussion, etc. Does that make sense? Questions, comments before we go into breakouts? Great. John, can you make the breakouts happen, or should I?
Yes, about 3 or 4 people, 4 or 5 people in the room.
I'd say 4 or 5.
Okay.
I don't know how the math works.
Okay. They will be open in just a second.
Great. Thanks for everybody who engaged in the chat. And if you want to say things out loud, as soon as John pushes open breakout, there we go.
They are all open now. Lynn, Wanda, and Connie, you should have an invitation to a breakout room. I will pause the recording.
Pretty soon, the magic is going to happen. We're going to go whoop. Welcome back.
There we go. Everyone should appear.
Here we go. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a really good conversation with your peers. I hope we didn't interrupt you at the most important part of the discussion, but that's how it is sometimes. So for the next 15 or so minutes, I'd just love to hear first, what are some of the things you heard in the breakouts that your colleagues are doing, that you're doing, that works really well, that seems like an effective practice that helps build meaningful peer-to-peer relationships, meaningful faculty or staff, student relationships. You can use the chat. You can speak out loud. It's probably, since we're a big enough group that we're more than one screen on Zoom, if you could raise your hand, that would be great. But anybody willing, brave enough?
I'll start with what I think was, I started with, this is a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, but it's necessary. And I've always made an effort to learn students' names, face and name. Challenge with a mask. Some of them look very different with a mask on, just to tell you from experience of last fall, but I still did it. I still knew their names by sight, even with their mask on. And that's the necessary condition. And so learning students' names and really being able to call on people by name, to greet them by name, sets the necessary condition. I don't know how you build a relationship without that. And I know, they're not here because of self-selection, but I have too many colleagues that don't really actually bother to do that. And colleagues that might have a total of 80 students for a semester and still haven't learned names. And, I'm secretly side-eyeing them and throwing the shade right now, because I just think they actually notice whether or not you know their name. It makes a giant difference. And from what comes after them, I think you have to start with that.
Yeah, Liz, first, I think you're right. But second, let me give you a little bit of good news from the research that this was totally liberating for me when I read this paper. And there's a paper called What's in a Name that appeared in Cell Biology Education. I can get the link and put it in there from a few years ago. It's a great paper, a large study. It's a study of very large enrollment courses, biology courses at Arizona State University. And the question was, does it matter if professors know students' names in large enrollment courses? And this is the big takeaway from this, and it's really important qualification. What matters is that students perceive you care to know their name. Does that make sense? So you don't actually have to know their name. They have to think you want to know their name. And so for someone like me, and shoot, teaching in masks, I have such a hard time distinguishing students from each other. But the fact that I try to use their name, or I ask them again and again to remind me, and it can become this stupid joke. What this research suggests is if students perceive the instructor cares to know their name, they're more likely to ask for help. They're more likely to feel they belong in class, and they're more likely to do more work. Right? It's not transformational, it doesn't change everything else, but as Liz said, it's foundational. And what they did in their large classes at Arizona State was the most important thing they did was have students create name tags and use them in class, even if it was 300 or 400 students, because then the professor could say, I can't read your name, what's your name? Or they could call them by name if they could see it. There was a really funny side benefit they talk about in this paper too, which is students started calling each other by name. And as one of the students who's quoted in the paper, a quote I love, it's much easier to ask someone to study together if you could say, hey, Liz, can we study together, rather than, hey, person I've sat next to for 4 weeks, can we talk? So great. So names or trying to use names are really important. What else did you hear? Lots of good stuff in the chat. Yeah, and Zoom can be helpful with that. Anybody else want to chime in with a good practice?
I'm going to say something that one of my colleagues mentioned, so I'm going to steal the idea here, but she had her students write the autobiography, and I think that's a cool idea.
Yeah. Yeah, is the person that's being stolen from, can you describe the assignment a little more?
That was me, and I'm very happy that you thought it was a good idea. I ask all of my students to write down their autobiography as their first assignment, and I give them some ideas on what they might want to include, but it's their biography and they can include whatever they want. But before they even do that, I've already done mine for them. And I'm very honest about, for example, I lost my husband a couple of years ago, and I tell them that. My daughter committed suicide last year, and I tell them that. I have 2 puppies. I have 2 cats. I tell them what I like to eat. I just share a part of me with my students, and I think it makes a difference because I come across the screen not just as a person, but as somebody who's willing to share with them.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for sharing that with us. Let me give you 3 additional versions of this that I've seen and learned from research or practice that I think are really interesting, that might be a little less revealing than what you were just talking about. Because not everybody is as comfortable or is able to share. One, a psychology colleague of mine, a Black woman who teaches psychology here at Elon, has this activity on the first day of class where she has her students describe a favorite family food, right? And what she says is it's really interestingly revealing about people because they end up talking about nuances. You know, they might look similar, but they talk in very different ways about the kinds of food, or they talk about what their grandparents did, or you know, something. So they can reveal what they want about their background, and they can find really interesting connections. But it's a safe way to share something. It's not as much as an autobiography or something like that. A second example, one of the places you saw, we did a quote, we did interviews at Cal State Dominguez Hills, and they have a first-year writing course at Cal State Dominguez Hills that most students are required to take. And in that course, there's an assignment that is commonly used, which is a literacy autobiography. In other words, write a bit of your autobiography about your reading and writing background. Where did you learn to read and write? What kinds of things do you like to read and write? What languages do you read and write in? Who taught you? Who do you see in your life reading and writing? And the faculty who teach in this writing program say it's really, really revealing, especially because a lot of their students are immigrants who don't have English as a first language. And so they come into this writing course where they're going to be required to write in English, thinking of themselves as not being skilled, not being capable, not being whatever. And then they write these stories about how important stories and poems and books and letters and things like this are in their life and in their family, even if it's in a different language. And the instructor can then use that to say, oh, so you have a lot of these skills. You might not have them in English yet, right? And that's what we're building on. So I thought that was brilliant. The last thing that is something I've learned to do and I've loved, and it's worked really powerfully until this, I'm teaching a winter term course, and it was fine this winter term, but it didn't have the effect it has in the past. I learned this in an anti-racist pedagogy workshop in 2020, which is when I introduce myself now, I show an old family picture instead of something generic. And the picture I share is actually my dad when he was 3. It's the only picture we have of my dad before he was an adult, because he was raised on a farm. There's 8 people in the picture, his family. He's the only one who went to high school. There's only 3 or 4 of them who are actually literate. and I'm named for my grandfather. So I talk about my background, and, students look at me and see me as this scary old white dude professor. And what's really surprising is I don't require my students to do the same thing, but I make a space for them if they want to share privately a picture or a story or something like this. And every semester until the current winter term, at least half of my students spontaneously have shared a picture or something else about themselves. So it's a really interesting way to help them feel like they can connect without, revealing, for me, too much about myself or positioning me like as their dad or something like that, which I don't want to do either. So great. Oh, a 1988 prom photo. You're braver than I am. So great. Someone has their Jeannie. Yeah, what do you?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
So just one other version of that is to have students tell the story of their names.
Oh, yeah.
How they came to be named. And it's really surprising that how many of them do have really family stories that, that it's not just they named me Susie. That's the end of it,
Right.
that there's always this backstory to it. So, and that seems to me that is helpful in learning names too, if you kind of know that story. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Jeannie. So, okay, so we've talked a lot about names and a lot about sort of autobiography things. Are there other examples of things you heard in the small groups that seemed really promising as possibilities, ways you could do this kind of work? Even in classes, in big classes?
I have to say, Peter, we went almost right away to the obstacles and
let's
the
talk about
COVID
obstacles.
era specific obstacles.
Yeah, so let's talk obstacles besides shaggy 70s hair. So what were some of the obstacles? Why is this hard?
COVID has just been devastating for young adults. I say this as a college professor that I think cares about my students, but I say it as a mother of a 19-year-old. It's just been really, really hard on their ability to connect and make relationships. It's been disastrous.
Yeah, it was hard enough, I think, to be a college student before a pandemic. And now you throw in the uncertainty, the distancing. I told John there was an interview with a student from San Francisco State University that showed up in the Chronicle of Higher Ed early in the pandemic. And this student, I can't remember her name, had this quote. I won't get exactly right, but I thought it was so poignant. She said, really what education is right now is me, my computer, and a bunch of people saying good luck. Right? And that's a lot. So COVID is really hard. Are there other obstacles? Oh yeah, Wanda raised the we are going to college, the sort of parents and all this. And that can be both the helicopter parents or someone I heard describe maybe this in upstate New York phrase, the snowplow parents. They don't just hover over, they like push in front. But it can also be first-gen students who have a very different experience where they feel like they're carrying their family with them, right? And if I'm not successful, then I'm letting my family down in a different way.
There's just the toxicity of our current culture and the divisions in it and the anger that's out there. And I remember hearing something on public radio the other day about how the younger generation is sick and tired of it. I think the hope was that they were going to do something about it. But in my experience right now, what they've seen from the older generations and from some individuals in their own generation and a lot online causes them to just clam up and not want to take risks. They're kind of, I used to work with a preschool program, and they would teach the kids to turtle when they were too upset, where they would, pull in to give themselves a break, kind of a twist and a timeout. I feel like this generation is turtling a lot.
Yeah. There's a book by, thank you, Michelle. There's a book that predates the pandemic by almost a decade called First Year Out by Tim Clydesdale, which is a study of a few hundred students in New Jersey who in their first year after high school. And one of the things Clydesdale reports in that book is that a lot of students, his phrase is, they put their identity in a lockbox. There's too much going on in their life, right? To think about who am I becoming, all this kind of stuff. It's like, I just have to navigate life to get through. And so, and I think COVID obviously has made that much worse. And as you say too, I think we have done a lousy job of in our society of showing students that, for example, you can disagree with someone without having to call them, without having to throw things at them, right? And so, how do we create spaces in our classrooms? And I think we have to do it sort of gently and slowly, but purposefully, to say, so we can do this, we can disagree about things, we can get to know people who are different and actually be interested in diversity rather than have to disagree with the diversity. Jessamine.
Just to follow up what you're saying, I think we've also haven't done a good job of conveying this essential component of success to students. I don't think many of my first year students would be able to identify me connecting with other people is absolutely essential to me succeeding in college. So that what was the term? Over-efforting. That's what's going to make the difference. Not, no, you need to go make a friend on your floor. No, you need to try to connect with a professor. That's going to make the difference. They don't know that either.
Yeah. No, and just a minute, I'm so glad you raised that, because we got to move towards concluding. And I think one of the things to think about is, how do we help our students understand this? And from my perspective, and I hope none of our colleagues here who might be business people or something, business faculty, take this wrong. It's not about building a board of directors of your life or, having the biggest LinkedIn network or something else. It's like, how do you have meaningful human connections that, yes, they might help you professionally, they might help you personally. There's lots of different ways to think about this. There's a brilliant book that's a study of friendship networks in college. It's by Janice McCabe. It's called Connecting in College. And she has this phrase that only a sociologist could develop. And it's so good and it's so awful to try to share with students. But she studies student friendship networks at a Big Ten school. And what she finds is the friendship networks that are most likely to contribute to students' success in college and long-term happiness after college have three components, which she calls academic multiplex ties, which is the sociology term that I think you can never say to students unless they're sociologists. But the point is, really good undergraduate friendships have an intellectual or academic component. They have an emotional component, and they have an instrumental component, in her phrase, right? And often students will have three different groups of friends. They have the friends who they go out with, they have the friends who they talk about school with, and they have their friends who they room with. And what McCabe's work says, as much as possible, if you can help students build academic multiplex ties, like enjoy the people they're studying with, help each other in different ways, that is super powerful. So I want to just close. I'm going to share my screen, not because I think the slides are so important, but there's two things I just want to show you as we conclude. One is a quote that I just love from one of the students we interviewed. I'll read it, even though it's short enough. Scott could have read it, right? It only takes meeting that one person who ignites a fire within you. Tiana Guerra, who said this, she was talking about a professor in this case. But when I think about this quote, I think, my class, my work with students, it can be a space where they meet that person, right? But that person doesn't have to be me. If that person has to be me, this is overwhelming because I have too many students and not enough time or energy. right? But can my work with students be a place where they're meeting those people who are going to ignite the fire within them? And then the last thing is, I know many of you are going to be reading the book. Thank you. If you want to reach out to Leo or me, we're really happy to stay connected, to hear stories, to answer questions and all this, because an hour is a short period of time and we have filled that hour. But I'm really grateful that you had me here. I'm really grateful you're reading the book. And Leo, again, expresses his love of the SUNY system. And if there's anything we can answer, questions or things like that, I'm happy to hang around for a couple minutes or just send me an email. And we're happy to talk. But thank you, John and Jessamine, for making this happen. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.